Sometime during the fall of 2010, I was having lunch with a friend in Munich, Germany. She told me she'd moved there from Berlin, where she'd been living for many years. Having frequently visited the Berlin State Opera, she'd befriended the wife or an ex-wife of George Soros. At the time, I didn't know as much about this man as I do now, other than the fact he was a Greek billionaire and a stock market speculator. He is, of course, Hungarian-American. During our lunch, I expressed my worries about the potential consequences of Europe's aging populations seen in the light of Africa's baby boom. Putting two and two together, I figured Africans would, one day, come to Europe on foot and in droves, looking to find a future their homelands couldn't offer them. She nodded, somewhat nervously, and said, "Yes, they will come to Europe. Millions will come." She knew. George Soros knew. A particular circle of people knew years in advance that Europe was going to be flooded with migrants from African and Islamic nations. It was planned, but it would take another 5 years before less informed Europeans, such as myself, would be made aware of the plot to transform their continent into a multi-ethnic dystopia. Europeans wouldn't find out about it until the so-called Syrian refugee crisis hit their shores in 2015. Even then, the media class, subservient to its owners, kept lying to our faces about the true nature of the Syrian crisis. We were told that dictator Assad was gassing his own people. Faced with such imagery, the peoples of Europe felt a moral obligation to open their borders to millions of newcomers. But a recent report by the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, casts the refugee crisis in a very different light. According to the leaked report, Assad hadn't gassed his own people. Instead, US and Israeli secret services had staged the gassings by manually placing gas cylinders for the media to find. The ulterior plan was to capture Syria's Golan Heights, a strategic territory much needed to expand Israel's regional power and recently officially awarded to Israel by none other than President Donald Trump. This means that the entire Western media corps, including nearly every single mainstream journalist, were complicit in covering up war crimes committed against the Syrian people. In September 2015, the media's frequent lies about the nature of the Syrian crisis produced a hilarious scene in my home country of the Netherlands. Shortly after the first refugees had arrived there, sheepish Dutch citizens had begun collecting bags full of children's toys to bring to the refugees. Hundreds of naive Dutch parents and their kids showed up in one of the larger asylum centers to offer their sympathy and help. Dutch newspapers were finally forced to admit the truth. One local outlet noted, "The first toys have arrived at the center where no fewer than 500 Syrian refugees are to be housed. There is a small chance, however, that the inhabitants will enjoy playing with the toys. The group of asylum seekers mainly consists of grown men." Indeed, the refugees coming to Europe in recent years have been mostly grown men of fighting age, having left their women and children behind in bombed-out neighborhoods. One has to wonder why. The media circus fooled the Dutch, but one must also blame Europeans for their almost innate naivety. What makes us so gullible? Why do we still trust the media? From 2016 onward, most new arrivals to Europe's asylum centers didn't even come from Syria anymore. People from all over the Third World began posing as Syrian refugees in order to win a European passport which secured them priority job offers, a monthly allowance, free public transportation, free healthcare, and free housing. In one extreme case, a Dutch mayor even awarded the so-called refugees 10,000 euros to spend on furniture for their free homes. Alarmed of such free wealth, more than they could hope to earn in a lifetime, men began arriving from war-free nations such as Bangladesh, Morocco, and Central Africa. Still, the media kept speaking of child refugees and much-needed dentists, architects, and engineers who supposedly had come to support Europe's economies. In reality, though, the newcomers were unskilled 25-year-olds who could neither read nor write. We were welcoming people in who had never even used a modern toilet before. In 2017, the waves of immigrants began to accelerate. As foreseen by Jean Raspail in his novel The Camp of the Saints, ships full of Central Africans were being fished out of the Mediterranean Sea on a daily basis. And then, all of a sudden, European women began discovering the meaning of the word taharush, or tribal gang rape, a phenomenon practically absent in European cultures before opening the borders to armies of hostiles. It became clear to some that Europe had been selected as the dumping ground for the displaced populations of wars being waged in the Middle East. Though the United States and Israel had been certain of victory, the tables turned. Turkey, Russia, and Iran sided with Assad to help lead the Syrian armies to victory over the US-Israeli coalition. Israel may have won the battle for the Golan Heights, but in the end, Assad has won the war. What should have been another quick and dirty regime change, like the ones we've seen in Libya, Egypt, Afghanistan, and Iraq, turned out to be Israel's first great military defeat since the Six-Day War in 1967. To the bureaucrats of the European Union, however, the immigrant crisis had come just as planned. According to a 2009 EU document titled Report on a Common Immigration Policy for Europe, the European Parliament had long decided that, and I quote, "Migration into Europe will always be a reality, that the European Union continues to need migrants' labor, and that the European Commission estimated the need for 60 million migrant workers by 2050. Today, already over 40% of German quote-unquote children under the age of 5 is of immigrant origin. Soon, all of Germany's major cities will have a minority-white population. The EU bureaucrats scoff at such racist nativism that seeks to preserve something uniquely European. To them, the destruction of Europe's nations, cultures, and peoples was a deliberate act. Once the white baby boom generation has died off sometime during the next 20 years, Western European whites will have become minorities in their own countries. And by the year 2100, Europe will have a dominant Islamic majority. Pockets of white survivors will have no one left to turn to for help but each other. But even if there's nothing we can do to stop this nightmarish scenario from unfolding, we can still go after the perpetrators. The time has come for us to start collecting evidence for the new Nuremberg trials, because there will be trials, and the guilty will be hanged.